Our Unitarian Universalist institutions are on a long road to racial equity and multiculturalism. From the vantage point of today's Hill, we can look back at the hills we have already crossed. As Nelson Mandela put it, we can see not only the missteps along the way, but also the distance we have come and the glorious vista before us. And yet there are many more hills to climb. With our precious religious freedom comes the responsibility to continue this long walk, which is not yet ended. We have an historic opportunity to finish our tradition's unfinished business from the era of the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power. Many of our leaders, from our congregations to the National Unitarian Universalist Association, are determined not to squander this opportunity. To give you just the briefest history, Dr. King's call to Selma was a defining moment for a young Unitarian Universalism, coming only a few years after those two streams of our tradition merged. Our congregations and ministers responded to Dr. King's call, marching in Selma and beyond. Several UUs were martyred, and many became radicalized. Then rose the cry across the country for Black power and self-determination. From the late 60s, what has become known as the Black empowerment controversy roiled our UU movement. Unitarian Universalism then stepped back from its full-on racial justice efforts for a time. Some individuals pushed on, both inside and beyond our tradition, but many needed a moment to rest between hills. Momentum began to grow again in the 1990s when the Jubilee Working Group for Anti-Racism formed within the UUA. Many congregations participated in programs of education and action under the umbrella of a journey toward wholeness. In the past decade, issues like mass incarceration also became a focus of action and advocacy work in UU networks. Just a few years ago, it struck me that we were once again arriving at a point of intense engagement with issues of racial justice and equity in our association. Not only has the Black Lives Matter movement helped wake up more people in our congregations and challenge us to live up to our demanding principles, but groups like Black Lives of UU formed within our own tradition. And then came a racially charged hiring crisis in the UUA just a couple of years ago, reminding us of how insidious systems of white supremacy can be. One of the institutional responses to this recent crisis was the creation of a Commission on Institutional Change within the UUA. If finishing the unfinished business of our past is one good reason to continue up the next hill in this long journey toward wholeness, the Commission on Institutional Change has, I believe, given us an even more compelling reason to keep on keeping on. This is from a statement the Commission members released on September 19th, just this past week. Our basic premise, they write, is that if we can live into the full participation of those who have been most marginalized among us, we can create a responsive, vibrant Unitarian Universalism. A Unitarian Universalist faith marked by full equity and participation will continue to play a vital role in transforming lives and communities. And that's what we're all about, right? Transforming lives and communities. This congregation has shown it has a desire to help our association move forward on its journey toward wholeness and racial equity and multiculturalism. To help us be a positive part of that movement, I'd like to glance back at some of those missteps of the past, as well as look at the vista before us today. The events of the Black empowerment controversy are too rich and complex for me to offer a full accounting or even a listing of all the events and personalities involved here today. So instead, drawing on diverse sources, and especially Mark Morrison Reed's new book on Black Power and Unitarian Universalism, I'd like to lift up 7 lessons from the past that we can carry forward as we continue up the hill that we are on now. You ready? Lesson number 1. This is good. These are things we can do. We need caucuses for different racial groups. Of course, we have many integrated spaces, our worship, and the vast majority of our programs, but these should be supplemented with race-specific groups or occasions. There, people can gather support by sharing their experiences, expressing themselves freely, learning together, and even strategizing. Black UUs and other UUs of color have unique experiences within our tradition, which is still predominantly white in makeup and culture. During the first Black Power movement, the Black UU Caucus and other organizations worked to meet this need. More recently, in 2015, Black Lives of UU, or BLUE as it goes by, got started. Caucus groups for white people can also be useful, giving white people a place to process, learn, and grow around issues of race without the risk of hurting people of color or draining their energy by pressing them into a teaching role. Lesson number 2. We need relationships of accountability. This means that if white people want to be allies in the work of dismantling systems of white supremacy, we need to follow the lead of people of color and support their self-determination. White people need to be in relationship with people of color in our UU communities at all levels in order to hear how we can be helpful. Now, superheroes are very big in pop culture right now, and I find I draw upon that imagery a lot when talking to kids. But it's the wrong image for this. For white superheroes to come crashing in, believing they have all the answers and pushing forward their own strategies for racial justice does little to advance the self-determination of Black people or other people of color. Instead, people of color get to be their own superheroes, and white people may be welcomed as sidekicks. A good example can be found at the national level in organizations that quietly continued the work of anti-racism during the period between the two hills of Black empowerment I mentioned in our history. There are 2 UU organizations with an explicit relationship of accountability, one for people of color and one for white UUs. Diverse and Revolutionary UU Ministries, or DRUM, as it goes by, describes itself this way. DRUM is a Unitarian Universalist people of color ministry and anti-racist collective, bringing lay and religious professionals together to overcome racism through resistance and transform Unitarian Universalism through our multicultural experiences. DRUM organizes community building events, leadership trainings, and is an advocate within the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. Its counterpart is called Allies for Racial Equity, and that group's work is summed up this way: building an anti-racist movement among white Unitarian Universalists in ways that are accountable to communities of color. So leaders of DRUM and Allies for Racial Equity are in regular contact about how best to collaborate, with Allies for Racial Equity leaders taking their cue from DRUM. Lesson 3, be realistic about who we religious liberals are. We have a tendency in UUism to lift up our heroes and not always remember the less enduring souls among us. Morrison Reed observes that UU communities are not above the challenges that face our nation as a whole. We may voice progressive ideas and earnestly want to live them out, but that in itself does not mean that we are woke or free of unconscious bias or that we have the skills to do the work. In recent times, long, sometimes contentious processes of education and action in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, including decisions about whether or not to hang a Black Lives Matter banner outside many UU churches, have challenged some of our congregations to grow. We don't all have the same life exposure, information, feelings, or points of view. And we're not immune to the historically deep systems of white supremacy that infect our entire American culture. Relatedly, we should expect that on any issue, People within any given demographic group are going to respond in a variety of ways because we are, after all, individuals. Black UUs are not a monolith, and neither are white UUs or other groups. As Morrison Reed chronicled individual stories and choices within the Black empowerment controversy, people in every group took a wide range of positions and chose from a variety of different strategies. And people in every group faced the temptation of hubris, which means we're all called upon not only to do the best we know, but also to remain humble about our understanding and attentive to our impact on others. Are you with me? Okay, lesson 4. Balance the prophetic and pastoral roles of the church. Morrison Reed observes that the imperative of seeking justice and equal rights was always clear within Unitarian Universalism. A commitment to Black empowerment and to ending white racism were not in question. The arguments were about which strategies to use. The other duty of the church, Morrison Reed notes, was the call to serve as a spiritual and emotional resource for those engaged in that effort, and for those who were not, to be not only a moral bellwether, but a balm for the wounded and a haven for the weary. Unfortunately, in his judgment, our tradition did not meet the challenge of holding in equilibrium these two important roles of both seeking justice and offering solace. If we become too timid about justice, our principles will come to ring hollow. But if we forget the pastoral and spiritual sides, we might as well be a purely political organization. Both are vital to our effectiveness as a progressive religion. Lesson 5. Develop strategies that can be effective within our UU polity, or way of governing ourselves. Morrison Reed observes that the way power is distributed within the UUA is confounding in its complexity. We put a lot of power at the congregational level and in the laity, and have built-in tensions like that between the president of the UUA and the moderator who chairs its board. With regard to the Black empowerment efforts of the 60s and 70s, because of this dispersed nature of power in the UUA, Morrison Reed explains, it was impossible to marshal its energy in service of any particular effort without a significant association-wide campaign. Investing that kind of effort in a predominantly white institution and its membership was not what a UU organization for Black empowerment was called into being to do. But without such an undertaking, there was no way to build the moral and financial support required to fulfill its mission. Now, we do have examples in our recent history of working effectively with the grassroots and sometimes authority-skittish character of our UU structure and culture. So I want to lift those up. The Journey Toward Wholeness program facilitated education and action at the congregational level, and groups like DRUM and Allies for Racial Equity have helped create a critical mass of shared commitment and strategy at various levels of the UUA. Most recently, after the charged hiring process for an executive within the UUA came to light a couple of years ago, some of our religious educators helped our denomination take positive steps forward. They invited congregations to hold white supremacy teach-ins on Sundays and developed resources to support these efforts in ways that could be adapted to each congregation. You may remember that Westside was among those who participated. We've held 3 white supremacy teach-ins on Sundays in the past year and a half. And now the UUA has embarked upon a funding campaign for Black Lives of UU that not only seeks support from key donors at the national level, but asks for pledges from congregations to ensure that we are all helping to fund our values and our vision. Westside's board decided in April, upon learning about this campaign, that our church would participate in it. And more about that when we take up today's collection. Lesson 6, use the right kind of power. I think some people, when they hear power, it kind of sounds like a dirty word, but power is just the ability to get things done. Morrison Reed notes that the struggle that transpired within the UUA and the United States during the civil rights and Black Power eras was necessary. African Americans wanted and needed to acquire and exercise power. Morrison Reed goes on to explore the question, in what ways was power exercised? There was plenty of father knows best paternalism at the UUA in the earlier era of Black empowerment, and racism was a factor too. But Morrison Reed lifts up another power dynamic that we must learn from, and this is the role of patriarchy in our movement at that time. Patriarchy operated in all the factions and strategies tied to the empowerment controversy. It wasn't just that men were present in positions of power in far greater numbers than women, nor just that as Unitarian and Universalist organizations merged, white men were anxious and were placated in ways that preserved their power. And by the way, Black men also overshadowed Black women in the racially related organizations within UUism at that time. Morrison Reed argues that the damage done came not just from the fact that male voices outnumbered female ones, but from the way men exercise power. Not by building relationships or negotiating among the many competing interests in what was an era of financial and cultural crisis for the UUA, but rather by taking adversarial stances in a my way or the highway attitude. The use of power over others rather than power with others led, in Morrison Reed's view, not to just a controversy, but inevitably to a tragedy, something that was lose-lose all around. Black women, initially in the shadow of Black men in support roles, stepped into greater leadership as this crisis developed, trying to practice a different kind of relational power. In the face of male domination, it was to no avail, Morrison Reed reports. And after most of the men left the UUA, many Black women carried on. That trend continues today, with women of color offering strong leadership in organizations like Black Lives of UU, DRUM, the UU Ministers Association, the UU Commission on Institutional Change, and moderator of the UUA. We are also served at the UUA level now by the first woman elected last year as its president. She is white. She is building a more diverse executive team at the UUA, elevating the leadership of people of color. And my sense is that we've come a long way from hoarding power and using it to dominate and get your way, to sharing power and using it in service to our principles. So let us continue to hone our skills and exercising power in ways that align with our values. Finally, lesson 7. There is no shortcut to reconciliation. Whether between individuals or within institutions, reconciliation takes time and attention. Morrison Reed gives a glimpse into the relationship of Homer Jack and Orloff Miller, two white ministers who had been radicalized in Selma, but who came down on different sides of the question about the strategies to use for Black empowerment within the UUA. It had become a pretty intense feud. While traveling overseas, Jack wrote Orloff a letter apologizing for letting the differences in their choices during this period cause a rift in their relationship and expressing the desire to rekindle their friendship. They reconciled, continuing their correspondence for another 20 years until Jack died. Some Black UUs left the movement after the controversy, pursuing their goals for Black empowerment in other ways. Bill Sinkford was one of those. A decade later, after his mother's death, Morrison Reed writes, "An old friend of Sinkford's mother from his home congregation showed up on his doorstep with a casserole and stories of his mother that helped him begin to grieve. It was the beginning of Sinkford's return to Unitarian Universalism, which he would later serve as the first Black president of the UUA. Other Black UUs, like Norma Poinsett, respected others' choice to leave the UUA, but she chose to stay herself, serving in a variety of national leadership positions because she believed in the sincerity of the UUA's commitment and that she was helping us to make progress on that long road. Reconciling as a tradition with the empowerment controversy has taken time. Many studies have been conducted and books written. Mark Morrison Reed's book that I've been drawing from heavily today is only the latest of them. He actually steered clear of this area of UU history for a number of decades, sensing that the hurt was still too raw among many of those who were directly involved. But his pastoral instincts, which are strong as a congregational minister, finally led him back to help us learn what we can learn from these past experiences. Today, a commission on institutional change created after the UUA hiring controversy has taken its time assessing those events. It is analyzing structural racism and white supremacy within the UUA and forming recommendations for how we can move forward as a vibrant, multicultural faith for the future. We must let the commission complete its work and commit in tangible ways to acting on its findings and recommendations in our local congregations, as well as our regional and national UU institutions. Here in North Texas, let us heed these 7 lessons of the empowerment controversy. 1, support caucuses for different racial groups within our UU spaces. 2, foster relationships of accountability. 3, be realistic about who we religious liberals are. We have big hearts, but we have not yet arrived. 4, balance the prophetic and pastoral roles of the church. 5, develop strategies that can be effective in our complex, decentralized power structures. 6, operate from the partnership power of power with others rather than the domination power of power over others. And 7, invest the necessary time and resources in reconciliation and institutional change. As the Commission on Institutional Change recently wrote, if we can live into the full participation of those who have been most marginalized among us, we can create a responsive, vibrant Unitarian Universalism. A Unitarian Universalist faith marked by full equity and participation will continue to play a vital role in transforming lives and communities. Let us help to make it so. Amen.